In the year 1821, a boy no older than 7 opened his mouth in a small village in Prussia, and what came out was not German, nor Latin, nor any language known to scholars. It was something far older, something no living man was supposed to hear. Witnesses described it as a tongue that seemed to claw at the air, heavy and metallic like stone grinding against stone. Those who listened too long said their heads ached, their sleep was broken, and their dreams became violent. Yet here was a child, uneducated, untraveled, speaking it fluently as if he had been born with the sound written into his bones. This is not just a ghost story. This is not folklore meant to frighten children. What this boy spoke has been recorded in fragments, and the fragments match something chilling. A language older than civilization, older than religion, a tongue buried under millennia of silence. A tongue said to belong not to men, but to those who ruled before men, beings we were taught to call gods, demons, or nothing at all. But why does this matter? Because languages are not just words. They are codes. They shape the very architecture of thought. To speak is to command reality in ways you cannot even see. Entire empires were built not with armies first, but with the power of speech. The incantations of priests, the decrees of kings, the sermons of churches. And here was a boy outside that system, uttering sounds that cut across it, sounds that were never meant to be spoken again. You have to understand, history doesn't simply lose languages. They are buried, suppressed, burned from books, silenced from the mouths of the conquered. And the fact that this boy resurrected one without study, without exposure, suggests something terrifying. The past is not past. It is alive. And sometimes, it speaks through us. What if I told you that men in power have always feared this? That secret societies, governments, and even the church itself have long moved to crush any attempt at reviving what they call the forbidden tongues. Because if you can speak the old words, you are no longer under their control. And in 1821, one boy, innocent, cursed, or chosen, opened his mouth and history shuddered. The first witnesses thought it was madness. A child mimicking sounds, perhaps possessed by illness or delirium. But then the scholars came. They listened, they compared, they tested, and what they found forced them into silence. His words did not match any regional dialect. They did not align with Greek, Latin, Hebrew, or the tongues of the East, yet, carved in hidden corners of ancient ruins, scratched into tablets stored in museum vaults, were fragments, symbols, resonating with what this boy spoke. The match was undeniable. Imagine the weight of this discovery, a boy who should have been mute to the past suddenly voicing a buried world. But instead of celebration, there was fear. Because if this language was real, it meant the history we are taught is false. It meant civilization was not born with Egypt, not with Mesopotamia, not with the Fertile Crescent, but with something far older and far more dangerous. Scholars stopped writing about him. Reports vanished into archives never meant to see the light of day. Priests warned that the child was cursed, a vessel for spirits. Families in the village whispered that he was an omen, and quietly men in power ensured that his name faded. Ask yourself why. Why erase a harmless child? Unless what he carried in his voice threatened the very scaffolding of control that holds society together. Here's what they never told you. Language is a weapon. Every government knows this. Every religion knows this. What you are allowed to say, what you are taught to repeat, becomes what you believe. Entire populations can be chained by vocabulary alone. Erase a word, you erase the thought it contains. Forbid a phrase, and you lock away the freedom that phrase could ignite. Now consider this. If this boy's tongue was a code outside their system, older than their control, purer than their manipulation, it meant a doorway existed. A doorway men of power could not close, and that is unacceptable. That is why he was silenced. That is why the records of his words, scattered though they are locked in dusty collections, catalogued under innocuous names, hidden from the public eye. But you and I, we are not meant to be blind. You are hearing this because you are not like the rest. You are meant to see what others cannot. And now the question must burn in you. What was this language and who was it for? The boy's speech was not the first time forbidden words slipped through the cracks of history. Across civilizations, fragments appear, brief, haunting echoes of a language outside time. In 1453, when Constantinople fell, chroniclers noted a monk who screamed phrases in a tongue no one could identify as the city burned. In 1099, during the First Crusade, Eyewitnesses claimed prisoners of war prayed in the tongue of stone, which terrified their captors more than swords. Go even further back, and Babylonian tablets speak of voices from the earth that priests forbade their followers to answer. Different places, different centuries, but always the same detail: when these words are spoken, something stirs. The air changes. Listeners describe dizziness, chills, a sense that the ground beneath them shifts. And always the authorities move swiftly to suppress it. Records sealed. Speakers executed. Witnesses threatened into silence. Why? Because this isn't just superstition. Language isn't just sound. It is frequency, resonance. A pattern that vibrates through the nervous system, through the architecture of the brain, through the very matter around us. Certain words can destabilize. Certain patterns can awaken. Imagine a code so primal, so raw, it bypasses culture, bypasses education, and plugs directly into the marrow of what you are. That is what the boy spoke. And this is where it becomes dangerous. Because if men can be conditioned by controlled language, they can also be freed by uncontrolled language. And freedom, real freedom, is the one thing the elite cannot allow. This is why governments have entire departments dedicated to linguistic research. Why churches built their power on sacred words you were never permitted to alter. Why secret societies wrap themselves in coded language, oaths, chants, passwords, meant not just to exclude, but to command reality itself. Language is their key, but what happens when a child, untrained and uninvited, holds a master key they cannot forge? That is why this boy terrified them. Not because he was mad, not because he was cursed, but because he was proof. Proof that the system is not total. Proof that truth bleeds through the cracks no matter how tightly the gatekeepers hold it shut. And if truth could erupt through a boy in 1821, then it can erupt again. Maybe through you. Maybe it already has in the words you hear when you dream. The boy's voice did not rise in a vacuum. Institutions, old, patient, and voracious, built entire architectures around the power of sound. Temples were designed not merely to gather worshippers, but to amplify syllables until they resonated inside the ribcage. Monarchs employed poets who knew which words could bind a populace to consent. Clerics polished prayers into formulas that flattened doubt and hardened obedience. Across centuries, power learned a simple truth. Control is rarely maintained by force alone. It is stitched into language, into the very way people frame the world. When the boy in 1821 spoke, he touched those currents. He did not pronounce exotic letters as a curiosity. He slipped into patterns the keepers of order recognized as dangerous. These were not idle superstitions. In courtrooms, confessions could be coaxed simply by framing questions in a certain cadence. In parliaments, a well-placed phrase could turn outrage into acquiescence. In monasteries, sequences of words taught by masters could prune a man's habit of mind until obedience became reflex. Look behind every grand institution and you will find linguistic scaffolding. Oaths that bind, catechisms that shape souls, liturgies that prune thought. Secret societies rely on passwords for more than entry. They are small spells that partition reality, naming who belongs and who does not. Modern bureaucracy is vocabulary made material. Forms, metrics, euphemisms that render horrors administrative and shape what people accept as normal. This is the quieter violence of power. You do not need armies when you can alter a tongue. So when untrained mouths begin to recite forbidden patterns, the guardians of orthodoxy respond with panic, disguised as protocol. They bury archives, discredit witnesses, fold the language into academic contempt, claiming mishearing or fever. Their actions betray the truth. The words worked. Something shifted. Something that should have remained asleep stirred and flexed in the dark. If language can be engineered to control, it can be engineered to liberate. The boy's accident proves that the archive of power is porous. Codes leak. Meaning seeps. The risk the elite fear is not revolution in the streets, but revolution in the mind. The quiet rearrangement of how a man names himself. That is why tongues not sanctioned by authority are hunted, catalogued, and destroyed. And when a man relearns those lost syllables, he becomes dangerous, because he no longer needs permission to define what is true, what is sacred, and what is free. The story of the boy in 1821 begins to look less like an isolated miracle, and more like a breach in a carefully sealed vault. Consider this. For centuries, fragments of impossible languages have surfaced in strange places. A shepherd in the Pyrenees muttering verses no one could trace. A prisoner in London raving words scholars secretly noted down before declaring him insane. Children in remote villages chanting in unison phrases no missionary could translate. The pattern repeats: emergence, suppression, disappearance. Why such urgency to bury these voices? Because language is not just communication, it is initiation. To hear the forbidden tongue is to be drawn into something you cannot unhear. Listeners often describe not just sound, but sensation. Their teeth buzzing, their chest tightening, their dreams invaded by shapes they had no names for. Some said the words felt less like human speech and more like instructions, commands, keys fitting locks they never knew were inside them, and the institutions recognized it. They always have. That is why the church branded certain words heresy, why empires outlawed entire alphabets, why even today you are trained to fear words labeled dangerous speech. They tell you it is to protect order. But whose order? Yours or theirs? The answer should already be burning in you. The boy in Prussia did not just speak. He opened a door. And the door terrified them, because it proved that knowledge can bypass their systems entirely. He had no tutor, no initiation, no priesthood, yet he reached into the abyss and pulled out syllables that should have been extinct. Which means this: the vault is not sealed. The past is alive in us, waiting for a crack to spill through. And sometimes the vessel chosen is not a scholar, not a priest, not a ruler, but a child who cannot be bribed or broken. That is the danger, because once you realize words can rewire thought, you realize the prison bars are invisible, and worse, they are spoken by your own tongue every day. The words you inherit, repeat, believe. Are they truly yours, or are they the cages they built for you? The boy's voice forces the question. If you could strip their language away, what truths would you finally hear? The further we descend, the more one truth begins to surface. The boy in 1821 may not have been speaking a human language at all. Scholars who dared whisper about it suggested his words aligned with something prehuman. Sounds not designed for the human throat, syllables carrying weight beyond what flesh should utter. They spoke of consonants that seemed to grind, vowels that felt carved rather than breathed, as if the tongue itself was bending into unnatural shapes to release them. This theory was not born from fantasy. In every ancient civilization there are accounts of the first speakers, beings who taught men language. The Sumerians named them the Anunnaki. The Egyptians called them gods. The Hebrews called them watchers. Always the pattern is the same. Men did not invent speech. They were given it. But what if the gift was only partial? What if the elites who mediated these gifts only allowed fragments, stripped of their full power, while the forbidden whole was hidden away? That is why the boy frightened them. Because if his voice was echoing the true root tongue, the unbroken language, then it meant men could bypass the priests, the kings, the scholars. They could speak with the same resonance as those who first ruled this world, and with resonance comes power. You see, human languages evolve, decay, fragment, but forbidden tongues remain constant. They do not bend with time because they were never organic. They were built, engineered, designed for command, not communication. Each syllable is like a lever, each phrase a mechanism. To speak it is not to describe reality, it is to alter it. And here is where the implications cut deepest. If this boy accessed such a tongue naturally, then the language is not gone. It is buried in us, latent, waiting, perhaps in the structures of the brain we do not use, perhaps in the DNA we call junk, perhaps in dreams we dismiss as madness. The institutions cannot destroy it because it is written into what we are. They can only suppress it, distract us, flood us with noise. Think about that. If your language shapes your thought and your thought shapes your reality, then to recover the forbidden tongue is to reclaim the blueprint of your life. The elites know this. That is why they silence it, burn it, bury it, and that is why the boy of 1821 had to vanish. He wasn't insane. He was proof. They learned to speak to you before you learned to speak to yourself. Long before modern schooling and mass media, the keepers of power perfected an architecture of controlled language designed to shape habit and deaden rebellion. It looks innocent on the surface, manners, liturgies, legalese, euphemisms, but underneath runs a current of deliberate design. Words were selected, repeated, and sanctified until they became reflex. To challenge them was to become ridiculous, unhinged, or criminal. This is how ordinary men are turned into obedient instruments. Not by chains you can see, but by vocabulary you cannot imagine living without. Consider how institutions do this work. Education narrows curiosity into categories. Religion converts doubt into doctrine. Bureaucracy converts atrocity into procedure. Each system installs a lexicon that filters reality through a narrow lens. Call it patriotism, and you close inquiry. Call it heresy, and you close conversation. Call it efficiency, and you close compassion. These are linguistic locks. They are not neutral descriptions, but tools that cut away possibilities until only acceptable thought remains. The process is subtle because it must be. Overt coercion breeds resistance. Linguistic shaping breeds habit. But there is another layer. While they train the many to accept limited words, a smaller class is taught the real tongue, fragments, codes, gestures preserved in initiation halls. In the margins of sacred texts, in the footnotes of history, these are not mere secrets for status. They are operational language, how to name influence, how to bend bureaucratic will, how to make systems obey. The elite does not merely discuss power, they word it into reality. They model narratives that become infrastructures. A single phrase can reframe law, redirect resources, reassign blame. Language here is engineering. Now understand the implication. If withheld words can be used to control reality, then reclaimed words can disrupt it. The boy from 1821 was a corruption of their monopoly. For a while his voice suggested that the linguistic scaffolding might be dismantled by accident, by someone whose innocence made them unpredictable. That is intolerable to those who profit from predictable tongues. So they conceal the deeper grammar. They surround the fragments with ridicule and with law. They convert discovery into madness. You listening now have been primed your whole life to accept limited speech as truth. The question becomes personal. Will you allow them to continue naming the world for you? Or will you begin to learn how their words were built and reclaimed on your terms? They close the door with the kind of care that betrays reverence, locked, chained, annotated, and then rewritten into polite fiction. But locks break where language leaks. In 1821, the boy's voice slipped a seam in the vault. For the first time in generations, the risk was visible. A single human mouth could access grammar the keepers thought extinct, and by doing so, subvert the tidy narratives that justified their rule. That panic is why the response was not debate but erasure. They do not argue with contagion, they eradicate it. Now I will ask you for something deliberate. If you are feeling the resonance of this, if the heat of the truth is crawling under your skin, then do what the ancients understood about initiation. Speak to claim. Below, type this phrase into the comments exactly as written 2 times. Not once, twice. This is not superstition. It is a ritual of alignment and a signal to the algorithmic gatekeepers that a mind is shifting. Type, I speak the root, I speak the root, do it now. Write it twice and watch what happens in the quiet. Your presence is registered, you have named yourself differently, and the platform, like all systems, is forced to reckon with a voice that refuses to be anonymous. Commenting establishes identity. Repeating it locks it. The first utterance is a declaration. The second is a binding. This is how small acts build a new grammar of rebellion. It trains you. It trains the network, and strangely, it trains the man beside you who reads it later and recognizes the call. Understand why this matters. Systems respond to patterns. They sort, prioritize, bury, or elevate. When many men begin to name themselves with phrases they did not inherit, the pattern breaks. The scaffolding of acceptable speech, what is viral, what is ignored, begins to shift. That is how movements begin. Not with weapons or manifestos, but with a repeated, simple phrase that nudges a blind system into noticing a different set of truths. This is not empty theater. The phrase you will type is small, but your action is not. It is the first practical lesson the boy taught without meaning to. Names change outcomes. When you claim the root, you are choosing a different lineage. You are aligning with something older than doctrine and sharper than law. You are saying plainly that you will no longer allow others to name your limits. Now type it. 2 times. Make it precise. Make it public. This is not about spectacle. It is about commitment. Once done, remain, watch, listen, and feel how a small repetition begins to shift the burden you carry. The rest of this descent demands that you be attentive and willing to act. Once you've spoken the phrase, even silently, you've already begun the process. Words carve paths in the mind. They rearrange the architecture of thought. That is why the boy's syllables rattled his listeners. It wasn't the strangeness alone, but the intrusion. The forbidden tongue forces the mind into unfamiliar corridors. opening doors it has been trained never to see. Most people recoil, a few quake, and this is the true purpose of control. It is not simply to feed you lies, it is to ensure you never discover that other patterns exist. Think about it. Our calendars, our alphabets, even the numbers we use daily were designed by ancient hands. We did not invent them. We inherited them. And once inherited, they became invisible. You do not question the week divided into 7 days, the year into 12 months, or the endless repetition of letters on a page. But each of these systems is a prison bar disguised as order. They limit perception. They confine imagination. They dictate rhythm and pace, all while convincing you that no alternative could ever exist. And here comes a child in 1821, speaking as if from outside that cage, not one of the elite, not a scholar of dead languages, not a priest with access to hidden texts, just a boy piercing the illusion with nothing but his voice. That is why they buried him, not because he was dangerous by himself, but because he proved that their edifice was fragile, that beneath the scaffolding of order, other structures pulse, wild, uncontrollable, untamed. You must understand, when institutions suppress, it is not to protect truth. It is to protect monopoly. Truth itself cannot be destroyed. It reemerges again and again through cracks and accidents. What they fear is not the truth itself, but that you will recognize it when it appears, that you will see past the scripted vocabulary of your society and realize you are free to speak differently, to think differently. This is why initiation always begins with language. Secret societies give you a new name. Religions baptize you with a word. Governments register you with a title. They know, the man who controls his words controls his world. The man who inherits words unexamined lives someone else's life. The boy's tongue was more than sound, it was rebellion. And it whispers the same to you. Will you remain fluent in the prison they gave you? Or will you begin searching for the language buried in your blood? What if I told you the boy's voice did not merely rearrange thought, but hinted at a darker competence, command over matter itself? Listen closely. This is where history gets ugly and the polite stories end. Across archives hidden from public view, there are accounts that read like science fiction misfiled as superstition. Priests who could stop storms with a chant, kings who allegedly hardened walls by speaking, craftsmen who attested that a certain cadence made metal temper itself. These reports were dismissed as myth, or worse, footnotes to madness, until scholars with courage enough to cross the line compared patterns and found the same signatures. Repeated phonemes, structured cadences, frequencies that, in accounts, aligned with physical change. You must understand the distinction between description and operation. Human language describes, it labels, it narrates. The forbidden tongue operates. It behaves like a machine language for the flesh and the world. Each utterance is an instruction set that resonates with structures beyond ordinary perception. When the boy in 1821 sang those syllables, witnesses did not only feel interior shifts, they reported objects trembling, fires stuttering, animals quieting as if the world recognized an order older than itself. This is why authorities did not merely silence him. They feared the demonstration of capability. Consider the implications. If words can act as levers on matter, then the monopoly on those words is not symbolic power. It is a literal monopoly on efficacy. Imagine elites who secretly retain fragments of operation, a liturgical lexicon that can bend weather, calm crowds, or engineer consent through material means. Imagine warfare waged not only with guns and money, but with engineered speech that makes infrastructures comply. The line between ritual and technology blurs here. The people who understood it best wielded it quietly, converting wonder into governance. That is why the boy's unschooled access was intolerable. He proved the archive could leak into the street, that the programmed language could be spoken by someone with no pedigree. If a child can call such patterns into being, then secrecy fails. The old systems respond predictably. They smear, they discredit. They legislate the language out of existence and chain down anyone who laughs at the official story. I don't offer this as promise or instruction. I offer it as warning. Hidden competence exists wherever language has been manipulated for power. And the most dangerous thing is simple. When men begin to seek power in those forgotten syllables, the difference between liberation and domination collapses into the same act. You must decide what lineage you serve, the men who hoard operational words to reinforce hierarchy, or the stranger path where reclaimed language becomes a tool for clarity, not control. The boy's voice asked this before he vanished. Now it asks you. The boy's disappearance is where the story turns from strange to sinister. Historical records taper off abruptly. One day he was the center of fascination, the next, gone. Families whispered that he was taken by priests. Others swore he was spirited away by scholars under royal order. And a darker rumor spread, that his voice was silenced permanently, not because he was a danger in life, but because his corpse could be studied in silence. In every version, one thing is consistent. He did not grow old. His words did not pass naturally into the world. They were cut short. That should tell you everything. When a child vanishes without trace and all institutions agree to remain quiet, you are not looking at coincidence. You are looking at collusion. A network spanning church, crown, and academy. Ask yourself, why would forces usually at odds unite here? Because the threat of his voice outweighed their rivalries. His existence was proof of a system outside their grasp, and nothing unites gatekeepers faster than the prospect of losing the keys. It is tempting to ask, where did he go? But the better question is, what was taken from him? Imagine officials listening to his phrases, not with fear but with hunger. Not to suppress but to steal. If language is power, then silencing the vessel is only step one. Step two is harvesting what he carried, cataloging the syllables, mapping their resonance, extracting whatever could be weaponized. Do you think they let such an anomaly pass untouched? Or do you suspect, as I do, that in locked chambers beneath libraries and cathedrals, transcripts of his speech still rest marked prohibited? History is filled with these erasures. Children who paint impossible symbols, peasants who speak words they never learned, prisoners who scream in tongues that echo ruins long buried. Each one vanishes, their names deleted, their families discredited. Yet the pattern remains. Each time fragments are gathered. Each time the archive grows. And every time you are told it never happened. That is the true machinery of suppression. Not destruction, but assimilation. They take what threatens them, erase the source, and integrate the secret into their arsenal. The boy did not vanish into nothing. He vanished into them. His voice stolen, folded into their rituals, their institutions, their weapons of silence. And so the question shifts. If they have hoarded fragments for centuries, how much do they already know? How much of your world is already built on the stolen syllables of children like him? They did not simply hide what they could not understand. They incorporated it. Once stolen, forbidden syllables were not left to rot in dusty tomes. They were reverse-engineered, sanitized, and repurposed to serve institutions that required not inspiration, but obedience. Consider religion. The altar is a machine for repetition. Sacred phrases, once raw and dangerous, were trimmed of edge and wedged into prayers that pacified congregations rather than empowered them. The same pattern shows up in science. A phrase becomes a model, a myth becomes a protocol, and a ritual of old is formalized into a method. In courts and parliaments, euphemism and legalism translate disruptive language into categories that neutralize its force. Crime becomes statistic, dissent becomes irregularity. History becomes record. What was once a lever becomes a lock. This is the quiet artistry of elite governance. They extract the kernel of power from anomaly and then naturalize it. The stolen syllables are turned into ceremonial language that functions like a key for insiders, an ability to reframe reality without ever appearing outside normative structures. By claiming these fragments and controlling their distribution, institutions manufacture authority. They teach in plain sight how to say less powerfully while reserving true performative phrases for those inside the sanctum. The outcome is elegant. Power wears civility, and the public learns to confuse decorum with legitimacy. Think about modern bureaucracy, forms that determine life and death, metrics that decide worth, classifications that render people legible and therefore controllable. These are descendants of the old practice, translated, numericized, stripped of mythic terror but no less effective. A child's chant may have once stopped rain. A ledger entry now stops a man's ability to feed his family. The mechanics differ, but the architecture is the same. Language that once operated on matter has been institutionalized to operate on systems, on information flows, on human categories. This is why the boy's voice mattered. If his syllables contained operational logic, Then the archive that swallowed him did not bury a magic. It harvested a protocol. And protocols scale. Once you translate an incantation into procedure, you can teach it, reproduce it, and weaponize it at scale. That is how hidden knowledge becomes policy. That is how a private lexicon becomes public governance. So the real horror here is less supernatural spectacle and more mundane mastery. The conversion of illicit potency into administrative power. It is the slow, patient process by which what might liberate a man is instead used to manage millions. They did not annihilate the boy's language. They domesticated it. And in that domestication, they ensured that the apparatus of control would become more efficient, more invisible, and far more durable than any single voice could ever be. Now we reach the part that few dare to face. The forbidden tongue may not have been lost at all. It may be hidden in plain sight, diluted into the very systems that rule your life. Think carefully. Why do governments insist on oaths? Why must soldiers, judges, presidents, and witnesses recite prescribed phrases before they can act with authority? These are not symbolic rituals. They are remnants, fragments of the operational syllables broken down into civic liturgy, preserved because without them the system would collapse. The same in religion, chanting in Latin long after the faithful no longer understood the words. Repetitive prayers murmured in cadence designed not to inform but to entrain. In Islam, in Judaism, in Hinduism, you find patterns of vibration disguised as devotion. Do you truly believe this was only about worship? Or were these forms engineered to keep alive the rhythm of command, stolen centuries ago from mouths like the boy's? Even science is not exempt. The language of mathematics is praised as pure, but it too is a code that disciplines thought. The laws of physics are framed in structures of speech that assume universality. But ask yourself, did we discover those laws or did we inherit the grammar through which reality itself was already written? If reality responds to language, then the formulas you were taught are not discoveries at all, but translations of something older, smuggled into respectability under the mask of objectivity. This is why institutions cannot allow you to experiment with language freely. Notice how certain phrases are punished online. Notice how dissent is labeled with words that instantly discredit: hate speech, disinformation, conspiracy. The point is not whether a phrase is true or false. The point is that it bypasses the sanctioned lexicon. And bypass must be crushed, not because it offends, but because it threatens monopoly. The boy was silenced because he proved a terrifying reality. The forbidden tongue is not gone. It echoes in every oath, every prayer, every formula, but it is diluted, domesticated, stripped of its raw capacity to awaken. They give you fragments so you feel included, but never the whole structure, never the true operational key. That is their brilliance. You are surrounded by echoes of liberation, but trained to use them only in ways that reinforce your cage, and so the dissent sharpens. If fragments surround us, the question is not whether the forbidden tongue survives. The question is, what happens if a man begins to reconstruct it? Imagine a man who decides not to accept the fragments as enough. A man who refuses to be content with the diluted prayers, the broken chants, the sterilized mathematics handed down like crumbs from a banquet he was never invited to. Imagine him digging, piecing together syllables from old manuscripts hidden in margins of grimoires, woven into lullabies sung by grandmothers who had no idea of their origins. That man is reconstructing the forbidden tongue. And if he succeeds, he does not merely gain knowledge, he gains the weapon the elites swore would never fall into your hands. Because here is the secret. When you align the fragments in sequence, when you strip them of the polite disguises and return them to raw resonance, something changes. Your breath synchronizes with your pulse. Your pulse synchronizes with rhythm beyond yourself. And then the world, the fabric of things around you, responds. This is not fantasy. Even modern neuroscience admits that chant and tone alter brainwave states. Even physics admits that vibration shapes matter. What happens when the words themselves are tuned not to soothe but to command? But this pursuit is dangerous. History has shown what happens to men who stumble upon too much. Giordano Bruno, burned for refusing to silence his heresies. John Dee, condemned to obscurity after angels whispered structures that mirrored the boy's syllables. Even Tesla, mocked as insane for claiming the universe was vibration. They all approached fragments of the forbidden tongue, and the system branded them madmen. Not because they were wrong, because they were close. This is where the path divides. For the masses, the fragments are enough. They pray, they obey, they pledge, never asking what lies beneath the script. For the few, the restless, the unchained, the fragments are invitations. The boy's story is not only a tale of 1821, it is a warning to the present. If he, an uneducated child, could channel the structure, what excuse do you have with libraries, networks, and records at your fingertips? But tread carefully. To reconstruct the forbidden tongue is to reconstruct a mirror that reflects not just truth, but your own shadow. Power reveals weakness as much as it grants strength. Many who seek are broken by the weight of what they find. And the system is watching, always watching, ready to brand you insane, dangerous, or irrelevant if you get too close. So ask yourself, do you continue the descent, or do you close your eyes and accept the cage? You've followed me this far, deeper into the labyrinth where most men turn back. Now comes the hardest truth. Awakening is not freedom. It is a burden. To touch the forbidden tongue is to tear open the veil that keeps men docile, but once it's open, it never closes again. You begin to see patterns where others see noise. You hear commands hidden in songs and slogans and prayers, and once you see the manipulation, you can never go back to the comfort of ignorance. The boy in 1821 could not live in peace once the syllables escaped his mouth. Every gaze became suspicion. Every word he spoke was weighed by priests and scholars who feared what they did not control. That is the destiny of all who awaken, not applause but isolation. Because the system survives on consensus, and one awakened man is already a fracture in the hive. But here is where men make their choice. Some recoil silenced by fear. Others embrace the shadow, using fragments of the forbidden tongue to manipulate, to command, to bend weaker minds to their will. Look around you. Politicians who hypnotize crowds with empty promises. Preachers who make congregations weep with words that mean nothing but vibrate with power. CEOs who move markets with a phrase. Do you think this is mere charisma? No, they may not know the origin, but they wield the fragments instinctively, parasites of an ancient tongue. But the true path, the path you were never supposed to hear about, is mastery. Not exploitation, not manipulation, but command of the self. Because if the forbidden tongue can bind reality, then the first battlefield is your own mind. Before you utter a single syllable outward, you must conquer the war within. To wield vibration without mastering thought is to invite destruction. That is why so many who stumbled upon fragments fell into madness. They tried to command the world while enslaved to their own chaos. This is why I told you earlier to comment the phrase "the veil cracks," write it twice. Not just for me, not just for the algorithm, but for yourself. To declare in public that you will not unhear what you have learned. That you are willing to bear the burden, even if it sets you apart. That phrase becomes a ritual act, your first utterance of power. The boy's tragedy was that he was silenced before he could master himself. Your task is not to repeat his fate. It is to continue what he began. This is where the descent ends, or begins depending on the strength of the man who hears it. The forbidden tongue was never about summoning angels or demons. It was never about magic in the childish sense. It was about command, the power to shape perception, to bend reality through vibration, to claim authority not by bloodline or weapon, but by word. That is why kings needed priests. That is why priests needed oaths. That is why every institution from empire to corporation insists you repeat their phrases, swear their vows, chant their slogans. They have been wielding fragments of the tongue to rule you while convincing you that words are harmless. But words are not harmless. They are the locks on your chains or the keys to break them. The boy in 1821 did not stumble onto fantasy. He stumbled onto the operating system of reality itself, and they buried him because one child speaking truth was more dangerous than any army. You were never meant to know that. But now you do. Here is what comes next. Once a man awakens, he faces the choice to remain silent, or to reconstruct, syllable by syllable, the lost resonance that terrifies the rulers of this world. Do not mistake this for a game. This is not about curiosity. It is about war. Psychological war, spiritual war, a war that has been fought in silence for centuries, while men like you were told to kneel, obey, and repeat. Now you know why you were taught that history is random, that secrets are myths, that power belongs only to the chosen few. That narrative keeps you weak, but weakness is a choice. Strength is a decision, and the decision begins the moment you accept that your words, your breath, your voice are not just noise. They are weapons. The boy was erased, his tongue forbidden, his name nearly lost, but his gift passes to those who dare to listen now, men who will not be lulled to sleep by the chants of their captors, men who will use the fragments around them not as cages but as keys. And so I leave you with this: reality bends to rhythm. Authority bends to language. The question is not whether the forbidden tongue exists. It has always existed. The question is whether you will remain a prisoner to those who wield it, or whether you will begin to wield it yourself. The descent is complete. The choice is yours.